One of the most prominent things that we think of when we think of the American Civil War is the artillery, the cannons, the big guns. And of those big guns, one of the most important types of those arms was the mortar. These were the type of guns that were used to besiege fortifications and hurl solid shot over walls and to rain down shards of hot metal on advancing troops. And here at the North-South Skirmish Association, they're still putting these platforms into action to see how accurate they can be.
There are really two forms of artillery competition. One is the mortar competition, and the other one, of course, are field pieces. The mortar match is fascinating. We will often have as many as 70 mortars, and they range from small cohorns to, there are a couple of teams that have huge siege mortars that are just, that big around. It's wild. What's extra fun for us to watch the match is that the muzzle velocity on a mortar is so slow, you can actually watch the projectile.
Most of them are reproductions. Some are as simple as a Confederate 12-pound mortar. It's something that you can get into fairly easily. Some are reproductions or originals of US-made mortars, and they're pretty effective. Of course, none of the projectiles that we use are exploding. They're all solid inert projectiles. And anywhere from a small 4.62-inch projectile, like a 12-pound, all the way up to we have somebody shooting a 10-inch, and I hear they're supposed to get one of those 13-inch mortars. They had a nickname called the Dictator.
What they're shooting at is a stake 100 yards downrange. They take 7 shots, and then they measure the closest 5 to the stake for score. And they have an hour to do this. And again, safety is very important. So they swab out the bores and all of that stuff to make sure that everything is very safe.
A mortar, basically, just like it is today, a mortar fires a projectile on a very high arc. And the idea, when you have land artillery and you're shooting directly into entrenchments, you can build an entrenchment either of earthworks, out of earth, or out of solid masonry. But what's nice about a mortar is if you're firing at something, you have something called plunging fire. And you have all that weight, all that power coming down on top of the target, and it's very hard to guard against, because when you have a projectile high in the air, you can set a lot of times they'll set a fuse, and as the projectile comes down, it'll explode. Another thing that they could do was use hot shot. They would have a shot furnace in the Navy, and they could take and get something red hot, and if they could land one, it didn't have to be necessarily burning hot, just hot enough to ignite embers. Very hard to put out. So they're very effective depending on what you were doing. Typically, they'd be used to reduce forts. You wouldn't do it necessarily in a live combat action, but you could get the idea was to get your mortars up as close as possible and then to shoot at the target.
Position 10, make it aim! Fire!
Well, the North-South Skirmish Association is America's oldest and largest Civil War period shooting sports organization in the country. We really honor the fighting men of the Union and the Confederacy. We're not politically oriented, we're historically oriented. We're into the authenticity of the Civil War, but it's through competitive competition. So the authenticity of the guns is more important than the authenticity of the uniforms, because you'll find a full range in our world of guys that, are perfectly uniform to some guys that aren't quite so authentic, shall we say. So anyway, but the guns and the ammo and the competition, gosh, it's fun, and you'd better bring your earplugs.
what's interesting, when that horn goes off, the tension starts. You get that that feeling, because anytime you're in a time, it's fun. You're sitting in camp with your friends and you're having a nice meal or something. But when you get out here, it's serious business, and there's some competition that goes on too. There's some people that are, people want the bragging rights. Plus, you've spent all that money, all that time, all that work into trying to shoot your gun as well as you possibly can.
One of the most unique events here at Fort Shenandoah during the North-South Skirmish Association national matches are the artillery matches. And there are some unique features of the mortars that you'll find nowhere else. During the Civil War, the companies that made these were bell foundries. And because they were proud of their craft, they made sure that when the mortars were fired, they produced this pure ring that harkened back to the foundries where they were made. And one of the amazing things about the mortar match, because of how a mortar fires and functions, when that round goes off, you can watch that projectile just sail right down range, and it's an awesome experience.
To fire one, you have to get it on a nice level area, and typically they would set it up to where they would have what they called pointing stakes. And on the mortar itself, you might see 2 colored dots. They would take these dots and align it up on a pointing. They couldn't even see the target, but they'd try to get a certain angle, and then they could use what's called a gunner's quadrant and get an angle of elevation. Some mortars were fixed where they couldn't change. They changed powder charges. Some you could change the angle of them and make them shoot higher or lower. And so the process is you'd fire, you look where your round lands, and of course you adjust for it. But what's frustrating is that you're not shooting directly at a target, you're shooting up in the air at something at 100 yards distance. And it's very hard to sight. There's a little bit of luck, there's some science, there's some art to it. So you have to gauge the wind, the temperature, and it's a pretty exciting event.
Well, the best way to get started is go to our website, find out where there's a skirmish near you, and go and see what it's all about. The camaraderie, not only amongst your own teammates, but coming down here, you make an awful lot of friendships. The camaraderie amongst our guys, it is literally fraternal.